Amazed as she started talking to me. When I first started interviewing her, she gave me some of the same stories she's been telling. Obviously, for so many years, she must have gotten tired of telling the same things. But because I had the scrapbooks and the diaries, it opened up another layer of memory to her. And she told me that she was just so frustrated sitting in that home in Brookline, away from her father, away from that glittering world she knew, that she just retreated, left her husband and her 3 children, she was about to have a 4th, and ran home to her father. But he's the one who told her, Rosie, you've got to go back. This is your life now.
You mentioned Gloria Swanson. Did she know about Gloria Swanson and Joe's
affair? I'm certain
affair?
she knew. What Rose had, however, is the capacity to put anything in any part of her mind that she wanted to. It's an interesting question of the biographer's art. I was never courageous enough to say to her, tell me about Gloria, because I'm not Barbara Walters. But one day in Palm Beach, all of a sudden she said, I'd like to talk to you about Gloria Swanson, and I nearly fainted.
That's a great compliment, though, to you, and it shows in the book. We'll be back. We'll talk about some of the Kennedy children that have not received the press that John and Bobby received. Rosemary and Joe Sr. and Kathleen. Fascinating stories. It's all in over 800 pages in the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, and you left us hanging with the relationship, Gloria Swanson, the affair, and Joe Sr.
Well, what it was that Rose told me was that Gloria had mentioned in her memoirs that the 3 of them had taken a boat trip together to Europe. And Gloria mentioned how extraordinary it was that Joe was so attentive to her that she thought Rose would have been furious, but instead Rose treated her very gently, and she thought Rose was either a saint, naive, or an even better actress than she was. So then all of a sudden when I'm talking to Rose, she said, oh, I want to tell you about this boat trip that I took with Gloria. And then she told me an entirely different story. She said, poor Gloria on this trip, and I could see her relish telling me this. It seems that on the trip, Gloria found out that her husband was having an affair with Connie Bennett, and she was crying the whole way over. And Rose said, and I had to take care of her the whole way over. And then Rose said, when we got to Europe, all the reporters took pictures of my husband helping her off the boat because she was so distraught, and that's where all those stupid stories started from. Oh. So she could decide she wanted that marriage, she had what she wanted, and she wasn't going to let it be ruined. So she put it at some level of her mind, convincing herself that Joe and Rose and Gloria were friends, all 3 of them.
But you're right, that she always believed that sex was only for procreation, and at the end of her childbearing years, she said, no more.
That's the story that I've heard, which would make it hard for her and Joe to have a very full relationship, because there's not that many times, if you're not going to have any more children, or you cannot have children, that you can really have sex.
Passed on that womanizing of Joe Sr. in many ways to his sons.
Well, you know, one of the things that's so sad is you see patterns in families. I mean, Fitzgerald was brought down in his political career by a relationship with a woman by the unfortunate name of Toodles, and that was the end of his mayorship. And then we know about Joe and Gloria Swanson, and you would hope that the Kennedy children would try and get away from that for the very thing that had hurt them as children. But so often, like children of alcoholics become alcoholics, it's as if this family tries to master the past by doing the very thing that their parents did and thinking we can do it and not hurt anybody, but people always get hurt.
And when you mentioned alcoholics, from back in the 1850s, they felt that the curse of the liquor, if you were involved in selling liquor, your family was cursed.
That's exactly right. On both P.J. Kennedy's side and the Fitzgerald side, there were liquor dealers and liquor owners and barroom keepers, and a lot of the people in the family felt if you sold liquor to the backs of the Irishmen who were then hurt by it, you would someday be cursed. And then they believed that's what had happened all the way through the ages.
Joe Jr. was fascinating. Much more of a father to those children, you write, than a son.
Oh, the incredible thing is that Joe Jr. was the model child. They loved him so much. I mean, I don't know how Jack ever got the confidence that he eventually got, because Joe Jr. was so clearly the favorite child. He was good in school, he was good to the other kids, he was disciplined. In contrast, Jack was disorganized, sloppy, and bad in school. But Joe was everybody's dream that he would be the President of the United States. When he died, it was the most devastating thing for that family.
And he began the tempting of fate of this whole family with his death, didn't he?
Oh, well, in the series of letters that I saw between Joe Sr. and his favorite son, right before Joe Jr. died, his father kept writing him and saying, you've now completed all the missions. He was flying with the Navy in London. You can come home. Please come home. Don't tempt the fates. But Joe Jr. just needed to believe somehow that he could do more than other people, he could become a hero, and that he was invulnerable. They always felt that. So he volunteered after he was long since past the time he needed to for one last mission in which he lost his life.
We have a picture of these 3 kids, Kathleen, Joe, and Jack, on their way to hear the declaration of war, England against Germany, and they were best of friends together. You write that they had no idea what this would do to their
I know,
lives.
you look at their eyes in that picture, and there's such a jauntiness, as if there's a great adventure about to begin, and unfortunately a whole generation felt that way. But you look at Joe Jr., and he would die in 5 years. You look at Kathleen, and she would marry the Duke of Devonshire's son, whom she absolutely adored, and he would die in World War II. And then you look at Jack, and he would nearly be killed in the war.
Right.
And so at that face, all you can see is the great sense of, this is great, something exciting is about to happen.
Kathleen's story is remarkable because of her relationship after her husband's death with Peter Fitzwilliam.
Yeah, in certain ways there's a parallel between Kathleen's intense life and early death and Joe Jr.'s, because here was a young woman who was devastated at first by the death of her husband, but then her native vitality returned. In fact, she wrote a letter to her friends saying, "Luckily I am a Kennedy. This is way back in the 40s, and somehow that's going to make me get through this." And she fell in love again with a man named Peter Fitzwilliam, and she was bringing him to meet her father in France. She was so anxious for the two of them to meet. It was a very stormy day. She was 28 years old. The weather report said, "Don't go up." All commercial flights were grounded. She had a private plane. She and her lover were in the plane, and the plane crashed right as they had predicted it would, in the middle of a thunderstorm, and she was killed.
And Joe's senior ability to hide many things from Rose. He hid the fact that her body was mangled from Rose. He told her she was peaceful.
Right.
He also hid something with Rosemary, their little child who was retarded.
Well, this is one of the most astonishing stories. One time when I was walking with Mrs. Kennedy in Hyannisport, and we passed a picture on the living room wall of Rosemary, and she just suddenly blurted out to me, she said, "You know, this was one of the worst things that happened to me in my life." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she then described to me how Joe had had a lobotomy performed on Rosemary in 1940, but had never told her because he didn't want her to worry. But still, it was an enormous decision to take upon himself. And unfortunately, the lobotomy was not only a terrible lobotomy, as they all were, although in those days people thought you could actually take a part of the brain out and it would make you never worry about the future again, and you could just live happily day to day. But hers went badly, and she could never speak after that. So Joe had her sent to an institution, and Rose didn't know until years later that that had even taken place. It shows what incredible control this powerful man had over that family, and how much love they had for him that they never questioned it.
The strains that Jack Kennedy was under all of his life, not only the Addison's disease, but so many other things, watching so many children die. You write about that.
Well, you know, Hemingway has a quote in which he says, "Everyone is broken by life, but some people are stronger in the broken places." And that's the only explanation for Jack Kennedy. He had a much tougher childhood than I ever knew, not only having to deal with Joe Jr.'s preeminence in the family, but he and his mother had a very tough relationship because he was so disorganized and irreverent about religion, and they really didn't get along very well. And yet somehow he was able to draw strength from all these people around him. The nurses in the hospital where he was continually because he was so sick adored him. His sisters and brothers felt that he was the Pied Piper of the family. His friends in college and then his friends in the Navy. He somehow made up for that lack inside by everybody else loving him. And that's where that political instinct came from, that vulnerability, that need, I think, which he then stretched to the world at large.
Rose said something astounding to you about if she had it to do all over again.
I remember thinking that I could never say this in regard to my own children, but she said to me, "Do you know, if I had it to do over again, I would never change my life for anyone else's. But even more," she said, "I am certain that if Joe Jr. and Kathleen and John and Bobby knew how short their lives would be, they would still choose the intensity of their short life over a longer, more average life." And that gives her such solace that she's in real peace as she approaches her own death. It's hard to imagine, because as a mother, it's got to be the worst thing in the world to lose those kids. But she's put it as God's will, and more importantly, that they lived intensely. And when you think about heaven being there for millions of years, what does it matter if they just lived short, intense years?
This book is absolutely wonderful. You should be so proud, Doris.
Thank you
and all of you
much.
should read it, and you should encourage your children to read it. It is a piece of history in these 800 pages that is so well written. The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, an American Saga. Doris Kearns Goodwin, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to have a chance to talk with you. We'll be right back with more.